You. I'm addressing you directly, and let's start with something seemingly trivial. Consider this. You live in a virtual reality where every sensation you experience from the moment you are born until your eventual demise is generated by your brain. Your brain creates an internal simulation that exactly replicates the external, tangible reality. But is this really the case? How can you even detect any inconsistencies in your perceived reality? Are there anomalies in this world? Perhaps you, as a modern person, are initially inclined to think of a simulation. However, the situation is much more complex. Most of those who accept the simulation hypothesis imagine the external world quite definitely. This conclusion stems from the prevalence of Nick Bostrom's seminal work on the subject, known as the simulation argument. In essence, Bostrom's argument can be summarized as follows. At some point, humanity will develop the capability to create numerous simulations of the universe that are indistinguishable from the original. Within these simulations, beings will emerge who, in turn, will create their own simulations, and so on, endlessly. The likelihood of us being at the initial stage of this chain approaches zero. Initially, this might not seem particularly convincing. However, when Elon Musk popularized this argument, it left many astonished. Yet, if I were to adopt Elon Musk's perspective, anyone might entertain the idea that they are living within a simulation. For the average individual who subscribes to the simulation hypothesis, the original, real world beyond the simulation adheres to the same laws of physics. Here lies the most intriguing aspect. Within the world, there exists at least one anomaly that currently defies explanation based on the known laws of the universe. Moreover, it is far from clear how the laws necessary to explain this anomaly should be formulated. Imagine, if you were to have your memory erased and placed in a simulation governed by the wrong laws of physics, what could you learn about external reality? At first, it might seem like nothing at all. However, this is not the case. Once you learn the characteristics of the simulation and understand how it works, you will not stop there. You would try to discover the origins and attributes of the various objects observed in the reality you inhabit, including your own existence. Eventually, you would come to the realization that a complete explanation is elusive. You would realize that the mere fact of your existence cannot be deduced from the laws governing the world in which you find yourself. Let me illustrate this with an even simpler example. Suppose you find yourself in a first-person chess game, assuming the role of king. The initial step in this scenario is to understand the physical laws that govern this environment and the consequences that follow from them. For example, you will learn that a knight can only move according to certain rules, but it also has the ability to jump over other pieces. You will also realize that a position with 9 white or black pawns is physically impossible, and so on. Having delved into all the laws of the chess world, you would inevitably conclude that they are too simple to give rise to rational thought. Consequently, you would conclude that your own cognitive processes could not have originated in the universe in which you find yourself. The more complex the simulation, the longer you will remain in the illusion of the reality of your simulated world. If the entity controlling you wants to prevent you from realizing that you exist within the simulation, simply shielding you from observing the outside world will not be enough. The simulation must have complete self-sufficiency and internal consistency in explaining all phenomena within it. Every question concerning the world in which you live must find its answer within the simulated physical reality. This principle underlies what is known as the principle of causal closure of the physical world. According to this principle, every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause for its occurrence. The universe includes all that is necessary for a thorough causal explanation of any of its components, and it is considered complete or closed in the sense that no non-physical causes are required for such an explanation. However, despite the principle of causal closure being a fundamental tenet of physics, many thinkers have expressed serious doubts as to whether a closed system is truly causally closed with respect to any aspect of reality, let alone the whole of reality. Such doubts led Newton to formulate the law of universal gravitation and Einstein to develop the theory of relativity. Similar doubts are likely to drive humanity to create the theory of quantum gravity. In addition, skepticism pushes people toward theories such as the flat Earth theory and belief in humanoid reptiloid creatures. Human doubt has no end and no edge. You can doubt global warming, the existence of the spoon or ancient Rome. You can doubt the landing of Americans on the moon, the fact that 2 times 2 equals 4, and even the existence of your own body. But what you can't doubt is that you doubt. I think and therefore I exist. These words are often attributed to René Descartes. But Descartes himself didn't want the statement to look like a logical conclusion. And in his book, Meditation on First Philosophy, he insisted on another formulation, namely, I exist. Because this statement is self-evident to the asserter, requires no justification, and is axiomatic. Many believe that it was with Descartes that all New Age science began, with his principle of starting with the indubitable, that is, with the opposite of what cannot be conceived. So, you might think that the world is illusory, that everything around you is a simulation, or that you're actually a brain in a jar. And some of these things may turn out to be true, or maybe all of them at once. You'll never know that with 100% accuracy. But what you do know now, and know for sure, is that you are aware of your existence. Consciousness. Many people think it's not common to talk about it in the scientific community, but it's not. Max Planck said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I see matter as derived from consciousness. We cannot retreat from consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything we consider to exist, all postulates consciousness. Consciousness is a term that stands for many different things. Type consciousness into the YouTube search bar, and you'll get hundreds of thousands of different videos. As you can see, I decided to add one more. In some videos, you'll be told about the immortal soul, in some about neurophysiological processes. Somewhere you will hear that consciousness has nothing to do with soul or brain, and somewhere you will hear that consciousness does not exist. And all this diversity is due to the fact that mankind has a very weak idea of what we call consciousness. For hundreds of years, not even a generally accepted definition has been derived. Of course, most people intuitively understand what we are talking about. Consciousness is used to describe what you are seeing, hearing, and feeling right now. Consciousness is an anomalous phenomenon, and it's not like the other phenomena of the natural world. Everything except consciousness is objective. Consciousness is subjective. Consciousness is something absolutely solitary, isolated. You can't look at consciousness from the outside. At the same time, we know that consciousness is a natural phenomenon that nevertheless does not obey fundamental physical laws. Despite the difficulties of studying this phenomenon, it is not difficult to define consciousness. The sense of mental images and sensations is consciousness. When you look at an object, you have an image of it in your mind. That image is human thought. With the help of laws of physics or even biology, it is impossible to explain thought and, as a consequence, consciousness. When I am hit by a car, I leave my imprint on two things: the car and my brain. If one survives in such a situation, one has acquired an inner content that is inaccessible to anyone else, an experience that will now float and periodically resurface as an autobiographical memory on the surface of the ocean of memory. To realize the form and property of the flora and fauna of our memory without simplification is not possible. Memories are often not even composed of words. What cannot be packed into words is inexpressible. Inexpressibility leads to the notion of simplicity and indecomposability. Some basic concepts cannot be explained with more basic concepts. For example, how do you explain what white or red means? It is an impossibility, because we do not see light as a wave of a certain length, but as a specific color. To our color senses, we have, of course, given names. The indivisibility of color and, as a consequence, of consciousness can be compared to the indivisibility of a quark. It turns out that the quark, as well as consciousness, is fundamental. The problems with understanding our consciousness are largely due to René Descartes, who separated body and soul on ethical grounds. The body is a vessel, and the soul is a rational being that is doomed to battle with the inner beast. The soul, according to Descartes, is not material, and thus cannot affect matter, but interaction does occur. Opera singers extract the right note, and the muscles of dancers contract exactly as the choreographer wants them to. Even a pencil outputting a poem, encoding a stream of thought on paper, moves under the laws of physics. The problem is that the monitor on which the stream of your consciousness, your life, is displayed does not stand in any particular office or bedroom. It can't even be found in any particular part of your brain. The workspace of your consciousness is not material, but it influences physical processes. This is where the fundamental contradiction that any philosopher or neuroscientist wants to resolve is buried. The best way is to destroy consciousness, to say it doesn't exist. It is easy to check whether a physical object actually exists. You can walk up and pick it up. This criterion of existence does not work for consciousness. It turns out that consciousness does not exist, but the feeling of itself does not disappear from this assumption. It turns out that there is no place for consciousness in the naturalistic picture of the world. But we can't abandon the notion. The pain of the blade is real, but from a philosophical, ontological point of view, we must declare consciousness a non-existent phenomenon. Besides, many researchers responsibly declare that consciousness is just an electrochemical process in the brain. So consciousness is the brain? No, because for one thing, it requires demonstrating a perfect substitution of mental terms for neurological terms. The neuroscientist doesn't care whether conscious states have a subjective private side. He is looking for the neurological expression of these processes. However, these neurological data are still sensed by someone. Thus, it is impossible to explain what we see, hear, and feel through neurobiological processes. It is as if we have something else besides matter. Why is brain functioning, which occurs for objective reasons, accompanied by a subjective and as if optional state? Why doesn't it occur in the dark? After all, our body doesn't really need us. Food is digested without our intervention. Hormones enter the bloodstream automatically. Our heart carries us into the future at 4,500 beats per hour. We can think our own thoughts and drive a car. Beyond that, we can even talk to someone, agree, and with a thought you will be in another corner of the planet, or even in the past. We've touched a wall right now, a boundary that one Australian philosopher called the hard problem of consciousness. But before I tell you how this man revolutionized, we need to understand the context. You probably didn't know that in 1994, when a book by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Era was published. It became a good thing to berate the great French philosopher who thought therefore existed for having slowed down the exploration of consciousness through neuroscience. The truth is that, in his time, René was not just wrong, but provoked an intellectual chaos that took scientists and philosophers more than 100 years to overcome. Educated at City College, René acquired the habit of spending his mornings in bed, engaged in meditation and reflection. According to Descartes, the thinking soul exists separately from the body and establishes communication with it through a special port, through the epiphysis. According to Descartes, when making conscious movements with the body, the soul, consciousness directs streams of special force to the nerves of the necessary limbs. This generates the movement of a person in space. In 1641, Meditations on First Philosophy was published. In this work, Descartes tried to formulate the distinction between the soul and the body. In it, the concept of dualism, eternal duality, was first formulated. Dualism is the idea that there are two beginnings, a spiritual beginning and a physical beginning. René considered both to be separate substances. The main property of physical or corporeal substance is spatial extent, and the irreducibility to matter of spiritual substance is thinking. The body, unlike the soul, exists in space and is a mechanism that can perform a number of functions without any participation of the soul. We have already understood this. Descartes considered animals to be robots because their behavior is fully explainable in terms of biological mechanisms. For him, they are beings of the same substance, creatures of circumscription. Descartes lived outside of time and so contemplated the creation of a machine that looked and acted like a human being. Since he had access only to 17th century technology, he believed that such a machine was impossible. A robot that looked identical to a human would still, in Descartes' opinion, be distinguished by two things. It would not be able to use language creatively, and it would not be able to communicate non-verbally. His eyes would give him away. It turns out he indirectly formulated the uncanny valley effect, even before Japanese roboticist Mori Masahiro. Of course, Cartesian dualism is one big contradiction. He himself wondered how the unextended soul interacts with the extended body. According to Descartes, it's beyond our comprehension. In February 1650, returning home in the early morning after a lesson with the Queen, Descartes caught a cold. The cold turned into pneumonia, and just a week later, Descartes died where he usually meditated. Descartes created the largest logical impasse in the history of philosophy, leaving science stuck in a Cartesian impasse for 300 years. Consciousness is a kind of property of a system, consisting in the ability of that system to discover its own existence. How can ordinary matter, arranged in a certain way, suddenly give rise to subjective experience? The eminent physicist and mathematician Roger Penrose, in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, concerning computers, minds, and the laws of physics, writes, It seems to me that much of the work of the brain is algorithmic in nature. I am a firm believer in the power of natural selection, but I don't see how natural selection can create algorithms that have some sort of conscious evaluation of other algorithms that already exist. If the concept of God can be discarded by saying, I don't need this hypothesis to explain the world system, then the paradox of the concept of consciousness is that it is as ephemeral as the concept of God. Yet consciousness is the only thing that is directly accessible to you. The only thing you can't doubt the existence of. Subjective experience is the starting point on which all human knowledge of reality is built. That said, all human knowledge about surrounding reality cannot account for subjective experience. As Schopenhauer wrote in his major work, that which cognizes everything and is cognized by no one is the subject. How can an organ that weighs 1.5 pounds generate a sense of life? Consciousness is an anomalous phenomenon, not at all like the other phenomena of the natural world. In 1989, psychologist and author Stuart Sutherland noted in the International Dictionary of Psychology, consciousness is a marvelous but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to determine what it is, what it does, or why it came into existence during evolution. You say, but how does consciousness give us an evolutionary advantage? If it does, it's not at all clear which one. All of your cognitive processes could very well take place in the dark. Such as was the case with Kenneth Parkes, 1987. One day he left his home in a Toronto suburb, started his car, and drove 23 kilometers to his wife's parents' home. Upon exiting his vehicle, he retrieved a tire iron from the trunk, used his key to unlock the door, and then proceeded to strangle Dennis Woods, his father-in-law, while assaulting his mother-in-law, Barbara Woods, before stabbing her with a kitchen knife. Following these actions, he returned to his car and regained consciousness. Kenneth Parkes was known to be a hereditary sleepwalker, a fact supported by forensic tests revealing his exceptionally deep sleep patterns. Consequently, he was acquitted. This case illustrates that intricate cognitive processes can occur without conscious awareness. Indeed, there's a vision that one day we'll craft robots capable of behavior so closely resembling human behavior that they'll analyze reality, make predictions, converse, and perhaps even convey emotions. However, despite their likeness to us, it's unlikely that we would consider them conscious in the same way as humans. Alan Turing, a pioneering English mathematician, logician, and cryptographer, raised this fundamental question in his seminal 1950 article, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Can machines think? He proposed that before attempting to answer this, we must establish clear definitions of both machines and thinking. Given the absence of precise definitions, he suggested reframing the inquiry to, can machines do what we, as thinking beings, can do? Turing introduced a test aimed at addressing this revised question, now famously known as the Turing Test. Essentially, if a machine can engage in text-based communication with a person without the person realizing they're interacting with a computer, it's deemed to have passed the test. However, the limitation of such tests lies in their inability to discern whether the machine possesses subjective experience, an awareness of its own existence. While a machine can simulate thinking, it falls short of actually experiencing consciousness. To begin with, Turing did not set out to determine whether a machine possesses an elusive consciousness. Furthermore, he referred to his test not as the Turing test, but rather as an imitation game, a somewhat ambiguous designation. In response to criticism regarding the test's inability to address consciousness, Turing emphasized the poorly formulated nature of the question regarding consciousness. He also pointed out that, in everyday life, we lack direct evidence of the internal states of others. We just politely agree that all humans are thinking. So, why should we set a higher standard for machines? And third, in his paper, Turing writes, I don't want to give the impression that I think consciousness has no mystery. There is, for example, a kind of paradox associated with any attempt to locate it. But I don't think these mysteries necessarily have to be solved before we can answer the question to which this paper is devoted. So, can a machine have a consciousness? Can you be called a machine too? Sure, you were not created in a factory, but there are no physical limitations to going out, assembling the necessary atoms, and constructing a human being out of them. Would such a person have consciousness? There is nothing special in every single neuron of the human brain. It consists of the same elements as the rest of the universe and obeys the same laws of physics. If you start replacing every neuron in your head with a high-tech artificial analog, Will you gradually lose your sense of self? The concept of multiple realizability is the thesis that any mental state, including consciousness, can be realized on different material media. What if you were to be split into atoms and immediately reassembled? Will you remain yourself, or will it be another person? The problem of identity is a philosophical problem, consisting in the fact that a person considers himself to be the same person at different moments of time, while his body and consciousness are constantly changing. In modern philosophy of consciousness, it is generally recognized that the best formulation of what consciousness is was given by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel. In 1974, in the journal Philosophical Review, he posed the most famous question in modern science of consciousness. What does it mean to be a bat? You know very well what it's like to see, hear, or touch the world around you. But unlike a bat, the experience of exploring the world with the help of the echolocation organ is fundamentally unavailable to you. According to Nagel, a being can only have consciousness when something is that being. That is, when the world is perceived from that being's subjective, first-person perspective. Take a look. Do you know what that is? These are physical properties of red color. But, as one of the creators of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, said, the objective picture of light waves available to the physicist cannot be reduced to the sensation of color. So, you can write a doctoral dissertation on the physical properties of the color red, but you won't find a single appropriate word to explain to a person with protanopia what it's like to experience the color red. It's the same with consciousness. We are unable to articulate or validate its presence. A prevailing belief suggests that no experiment could illustrate how consciousness influences our surroundings. How can one ascertain that their actions are truly conscious choices? They are influenced by various physical factors, reacting accordingly. These influences may stem from both external and internal sources, some apparent and others not. As the same Schopenhauer said, man can do what he wants, but he cannot want at will. The theory that consciousness is some kind of exhaust of internal, physical, and biochemical processes is called epiphenomenalism. A simple example is that it's not fear that causes a surge of adrenaline and a rapid heartbeat. It is the adrenaline surge and rapid heartbeat that is felt as a feeling of fear. The feeling of fear is an epiphenomenon. Therefore, there are a certain number of people who believe that the concept of awareness should be abandoned like the concept of ether was once abandoned. Now, I will introduce you to a man who claims that he has no inner self. At least, he insists that he does. This is the American philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett. In his 1991 book, Consciousness Explained, Dennett attempts to prove that consciousness is made up of multiple streams of information that compete for access to the brain and thus influence human behavior. Dennett's explanation of human consciousness is strikingly similar to the workings of a complex but unconscious robot controlled by built-in programs. Many people wish it were that simple. This would immediately close the problems of inducibility of consciousness from physical processes. However, in 1993, Australian mathematician and philosopher David Chalmers delivered his doctoral thesis, presenting the concept of the hard problem of consciousness. Even after we have explained the physical computational functioning of a conscious system, using traditional methods used in neurobiology and cognitive science, we still need to explain why this system has conscious experience. That is, you can try all you want to derive a theory of consciousness through electrochemical processes, the workings of the prefrontal cortex, or quantum effects in microtubules from the brain. Talk about how Broca's area is responsible for speech. The cerebellum is responsible for coordination. The amygdalae are responsible for emotions, and the occipital area is responsible for vision. But that doesn't explain why something is currently aware of the reflection of its physical shell on the surface of a black screen. If you haven't read Harry Potter and Methods of Rationality, then close the pseudo-intellectual babble and run to read it. That's where the real fun is. And if you have, you know the author. Eliezer Yudkowsky. He is a specialist in artificial intelligence, and naturally he is interested in problems of consciousness. In his article Zombies, he writes that it is possible to imagine your double who will have the same behavior and speech, the same brain. Even every atom and quark of his body will be in the same position as yours. He will be completely identical to you, except that he will have no consciousness. We are talking about a so-called philosophical zombie, and the possibility of such a zombie world is recognized by a significant fraction, if not most academic philosophers of consciousness. In his article, Yudkowsky writes, "You are not the one who utters your thoughts. You are the one who hears them." A zombie in this case has thoughts in his head that are spoken, but there is no one who can hear them. Thus, if we believe that consciousness exists and that philosophical zombies are possible, we must conclude that consciousness does not interact with physical reality in any way. It follows that consciousness is a non-physical property. Many interesting corollaries can be deduced from this. For example, that we live in a simulation, but common sense suggests that it is more likely that one of the premises is false. Yudkowsky, for example, says that the zombie argument is completely absurd because no zombie would ever write an article about consciousness, much less argue on the subject. Some will say it's all philosophy, as if it's something bad. You can't say a problem doesn't exist just because it's philosophical. Galileo Galilei, Robert Hooke, Isaac Newton, they all considered themselves philosophers because the problems of space and time were philosophical at the time. But having developed general principles of systematic, mathematical, empirical approaches to their solution, these questions were separated into a separate field of knowledge, which was called physics. This is the meaning of philosophy. It deals with difficult problems that cannot be considered separately yet, and the questions of what is scientific and what is not are also dealt with by philosophy. It is what defines concepts, boundaries, and methodology. David Chalmers, I remind you, is the one who introduced the term hard problem of consciousness. David Chalmers is one of the most influential philosophers of our time. His book, The Conscious Mind, In Search of a Fundamental Theory, was a real sensation in its time. Almost everyone who has written books on consciousness in recent decades has referred to it. He was recently invited to a 17th scientific conference on whether our universe is a computer simulation. He also says he would like to remain a materialist scientist. But at the same time, Chalmers believes that in hundreds of years we have not advanced one iota in the study of the phenomenon of consciousness because our ideas have not been radical enough or even crazy enough, and to introduce consciousness into science, given its properties. This is what is needed. Ideas must be as bold as the idea that the sun does not revolve around the earth, or that time is relative, or that cat can be both alive and dead at the same time. Already from the knowledge we have now, we can conclude that our world is pretty absurd. So why would the nature of consciousness be any different? Chalmers, in pursuit of his theory, puts forward the really totally extravagant idea that since any attempt to explain consciousness in physical terms leads to a difficult problem, since consciousness cannot be reduced to basic properties of matter, then consciousness is itself a basic property, and it is fundamental. It is some elementary property of our universe, manifest in everything, but in humans because of their complexity, most of all. The view that the conscious aspect is a fundamental feature of reality is called panpsychism. Schrödinger wrote, "The reason why our feeling, perceiving, and thinking ego is nowhere to be found within our scientific picture of the world can be easily labeled in 7 words. It is itself that very picture of the world. It is identical with the whole, and therefore cannot be contained within it, as a part of it. We have physics and math, we have theory, and a vast experimental base. Perhaps one day we will study every conceivable aspect of physical reality and derive all the formulas." But in the conclusion of his Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking writes, "Even if there is only one possible unified theory, it is only a set of rules and equations. What breathes fire into the equations and creates a universe they can describe? The traditional scientific approach, which is to build a mathematical model, cannot answer the question, why should the universe described by the model exist? Why does the universe bother to exist at all? Is it possible that in asking the question of what is consciousness, we are starting from the wrong place? Is it possible that the hard problem of consciousness flows from the hard problem of matter?" Thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your opinion in the comments.